Good evening, AP Euro scholars. We're back at it again with a short little screencast here from deep within quarantine. We're at the Corrigan headquarters, trying to get a couple of topics out of the way. I know you're more than happy to hear my beautiful tonal voice once again, so let's get right down to it. The 1920s was a time of optimism as economies stabilized and the post-World War I world kind of took shape. It wasn't the best of times, but it definitely wasn't the worst of times, especially in the United States. However, in the 1930s, that will change drastically, as you know. 1929 hits, we have the stock market crash, we have the onset of the Great Depression, and pretty soon that optimism that epitomized by the Jazz Age, the Roaring 20s, the Flapper Girls of the United States, quickly turns to instability and misfortune for much of Europe and the world as a result of the Great Depression. So we go from this to this. Pretty straightforward. Moving right along. You should be familiar with the Great Depression at this point. A lot of underlying causes. We had tons of overproduction in the post-World War I economies of Europe. Businesses, agricultural produce was churning out more than what the people could handle. That leads to falling prices. It leads to a collapse of the economic system, especially when you had companies that looked better on paper than they were, thus causing a lot of people to buy more stocks than they should and borrowing money to do that. You want to get involved in the stock market, but you don't want to borrow money. You don't want to spend the rent trying to hit it big on the stock market. That's not really how it works. You invest for the long term. You're not trying to get rich quick. But a lot of people in the 1920s were, because they thought the stock market was increasing at rates that were records, and that this was a new plateau, a new era, a new paradigm, and that the stock prices would never fall, which of course is not true, because then they get hit by a stock market bubble where companies were overvalued, over-speculated, and then those investors, quote-unquote investors, people who had no business being involved in the stock market in the first place, start pulling their money out of the stock market as quickly as they can. That panic causes economic collapse and failure and created the basis of the Great Depression. But it's not alone. This downward economic spiral continues as companies lose value. They start laying off employees. Those employees then start spending less, which hurts other companies, and it creates this downward economic spiral of slowing production, more layoffs, more recession, less consumerism, less production, more layoffs, etc., etc., etc. The only thing that can pull these countries out of the Great Depression is ultimately going to be the wartime economies of World War II. Certainly you don't want to have to resort to terrible World War in order to get back to where you started. This all coincides with the Dust Bowl in the United States, which certainly helped churn things up a little bit here. There was tons of westward expansion in the United States, and at the time, people believed that the more you plowed the soil, the more it would rain, and the more crops you would yield. And so they kept plowing and plowing and plowing, and they overplanted, and ultimately they get hit by a huge drought, which happens in the plains region all too often, and the resulting Dust Bowl hurt farmers across the United States heartland, who were then evicted from their lands and out of work, and added to the unemployment, the uncertainty, the instability of it all. And you can see these huge dust plumes. Winds whipped up tons and tons of dust and then would deposit it hundreds of miles away. Ultimately, it's going to result in a worldwide financial crisis, with mass unemployment being the telltale sign of the Great Depression. Some figures, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 33% unemployment rates for Germany in 1932. That's going to create a lot of men out of work, a lot of men who are upset, angry, and looking for solutions to their problems. And of course, one thing you know about fascists is they have simple solutions to complex problems. They get rich quick schemes, if you will. In the United States, this unemployment reaches its peak of about 30% in 1933, which causes a lot of people out of work, a lot of people in line for soup kitchens, including yours truly. This is a shot from the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C., not too many years ago. Here you get a look at the effects of the Dust Bowl on the Great Plains region of the United States, stretching from Texas to North Dakota and all points in between. The people who are going to be displaced from their lands and their farms are going to end up looking for work. A lot of them heading west to California. That's kind of the Grapes of Wrath story from that time period. These conditions created an opportunity for totalitarian regimes to emerge on the political scene. Now we have totalitarian regimes from the left and totalitarian regimes from the right. In both cases, they are, well, similar in some ways, different in others, I guess is kind of the way you want to, if you want to say it. You have the Soviet Union and you have fascism. Both are totalitarian. Both are part of what we call the lunatic fringe, but they're the opposite ends of the political spectrum. Usually if the political spectrum were one line, they would be as far away from each other as they could possibly be. They're sworn enemies, after all. The fascists hate the communists, and the communists hate the fascists. But in reality, they look kind of similar, and they operate in some similar manners as well. So we'll see that here on the next slide. For fascists, there's much more of a national focus. This was a political ideology focused on building the nation and defining what was the nation, and then bringing glory to that through an aggressive foreign policy and expansionism. So there's a lot of focus on creating an empire, the Third Reich of Nazi Germany, for example, the renewed Roman Empire under Mussolini. They're not looking to get rid of classes. The Nazis, the fascists under Mussolini, they work with big business. They're in cahoots with big business. They are, or want to be, or strive to be part of the upper class. So they're looking much more for class cooperation. All of us are pulling, whether you're on the assembly line or you own the assembly line, all of us are pulling in the same direction. So they're not looking to take away anybody's private property. They're not looking to get rid of the bourgeoisie or the upper class or anything along those lines. Instead, they focus their energies on defining who they are and who their enemies are, and they engage in a practice called eugenics. Those eugenics, I think we've talked about before, they're kind of part of social Darwinist thought that you could create some sort of perfect race of people through selective breeding, largely by identifying characteristics in people that you don't want to be part of your national community and eliminating them, getting rid of them, and encouraging those who are part of your ideal group, in the case of Nazi Germany, the pure Aryan race, if you will, to then breed and be fruitful and multiply to create some sort of super race in the future. Meanwhile, on the communist side, we have much more of an international focus. You think back to Marx, workers of the whole world unite. The communists in the Soviet Union, Lenin and Stalin, will focus more on Russian issues because that's where they are, but ultimately their goal is to create an international brotherhood of workers to spread communism throughout the globe, because they can't survive as the only communist nation in the world surrounded by capitalist pigs who want them to fail. So, as you can imagine, there's a lot more focus on class consciousness, class leveling. All of us are equal, comrades. Some of us are more equal than others, but for the most part, they're looking to eliminate that bourgeois component. They focus on socially engineering. Enemies of the revolution are out. Those of us who are in will continue on living for now. In both cases, we have this similar idea of a cult of personality. They're led by a charismatic ruler, whether it's Mussolini, whether it's Hitler, whether it's Stalin, and they are part part of a large state bureaucracy that controls information. They often have a secret police force as well as a huge police force. They use violence, they use terror to get what they want, to silence their critics, to limit the liberties of their people. And like I said, whether it's eugenics or whether it's class leveling, they're engineering some sort of social utopia for their people. In order for them to succeed, they need the population to go along with them. They're outnumbered. Even Hitler, for all of his popularity, never won a majority of the Reichstag, in electoral campaigns. So he and Stalin and Mussolini require the mass of the population to fall into some sort of moral gray zone where they compromise their values and morals in order to stay alive. They're afraid for their own self-preservation, and so they look the other way, or they are complicit in some way to what is going on with the regime. They don't stand up to racism, they don't stand up to class leveling, anti-intellectualism, whatever it may be, because either they feel like they can't or they don't want to, and that's a big part of what gives the fascists and the communists their power over their own populations. All right, last topic for now, we'll make it real quick, is Stalin's 5-year plans. And this is an important part of the rise of the Soviet Union in the 1930s and 40s. It's actually a series of 5-year plans. It started as one, where he wanted to recreate the Industrial Revolution in 5 years. You remember the Industrial Revolution, don't you? Started in the 1780s in Britain, spread to the continent in the early 1800s, really kicks off in the Second Industrial Revolution after the 1850s with railroad building and factories. Yeah, all that took like 100 years to do in the West, he wants to do that in 5 years, or at least a couple of 5-year increments. So this is a very ambitious plan on his part, very lofty goals. He's hoping to achieve somewhere in the neighborhood of 150% increased agricultural production, largely through the collectivization of agriculture. You have land, I have land, great. Now let's all pool our resources. We all have the same land that we're sharing. You have a tractor, I don't. I'll borrow yours. And we're all the same here, comrade. He was then going to use that 150% agricultural production to sell surplus for profit. That profit was going to be put into investing in industrial output. So factories, heavy machinery, steel production, weapons production. That kind of heavy industry was then going to propel the Soviet Union into the 20th century and catch up to and ultimately surpass the West. So it was this idealized utopian view of, hey, we'll all work together, we'll all pool our resources, in that way we'll do better than we've ever done before in terms of agricultural output. We'll have this big Thanksgiving spread, at the harvest time, we'll sell the surplus, and then we'll turn that into industrial power. Here we are on, the train to the future. Didn't exactly happen. Despite Stalin's best efforts, despite the Gosplan, this centrally planned economic body that's going to decide what's produced and how much is produced and set quotas, it's impossible to artificially recreate the Industrial Revolution in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. They succeed in some avenues. They do meet some quotas in industrial output, although the numbers are shaky and shady because people would start fudging the numbers. The books were cooked because if you didn't meet your quota, you could get the gulag or worse. So a lot of times people would say, hey, did you meet your quota? Yeah, absolutely I met my quota, because if you didn't, you'd be replaced. You'd be sent off and somebody else would have control of your factory, even though it's all government owned anyway. So again, it's that self-preservation there. These are a couple of topics to look at from chapter 26 and 27. Hopefully we'll have a chance to Google Meet online at some point to talk about this or chat about this some way, shape, or form. But for now, hopefully that was informative and worthwhile. So good luck to you. We'll talk to you soon.